You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast, and this is our interview with James Jones, the director of Antidote, a documentary premiering at this year's Tribeca.
Sometimes when you film with someone who's going through something difficult, it does become a way of processing it. It's like something to focus on is making the documentary.
Usually the first question we ask our guests on the show is about how they fell in love with films and filmmaking in the first place. So what's your story?
So actually the first job I had after university, I studied Russian and lived in Russia. So my first job was as a translator on a documentary about Russian oligarchs. And as a translator, you get to see every stage of the process. So you're out filming, you're in the edit, you're translating the interviews. And I just fell in love. I couldn't believe as a 21-year-old that you could get access to these kind of people. They would talk to you just because you had a camera. And then seeing the kind of creative process of the edits, working with a couple of brilliant editors. It just it felt like, I thought I wanted to be a written journalist, but then understanding the process of filmmaking with, the music, the editing, the kind of emotional power that you could bring to it just was so intoxicating. So I fell in love with it. And then as I've continued in the industry to get to work myself, making my own films with brilliant editors and composers, it's just so exciting to take that journalism, but turn it into something cinematic and, with a emotional human power to it as well.
Was it right from the get-go documentary, or was there a time when you started to gravitate towards documentary over fiction?
Yeah, I think for me, it was always documentary. I think some people study film and come up through that way. I came through more of a journalistic route, and then film felt like the best medium. And then it was more as time went by that I kind of became more obsessed with the actual craft of filmmaking. And I think once you start shooting yourself and working with good cinematographers, and you just you understand the language of film more. So I think for me, it was always documentary. And actually, I did a series for Apple last year or year before, and I did some drama elements of that. And I did actually love that. So I don't know, maybe working with actors, I can see why people get addicted to that as well, because just the possibilities are so endless. With documentary, you're limited by what actually happens in front of camera. Whereas working with actors and creating a whole world is just quite liberating. So, but with this one, we wanted it to stay quite real and in the moment, and didn't want to do kind of dramatic drama reenactments or anything like that.
The urgency of the story you want to tell and do so is probably, or at least the way I see, the number one aspect from a filmmaking standpoint, and things are happening and the tides are changing quite fast. Does this lead to additional pressure or rush you to some extent so that you don't miss anything?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when the film was first conceived, it was more of a retrospective look at Putin's assassination program through Bellingcat's investigations. So it was almost like Bellingcat's greatest hits, all the assassins they had exposed, which is fascinating. They've done amazing work. But as a filmmaker, I'm usually more drawn to, particularly when it's a story that is ongoing and changing constantly. I always want to lean into something that is really unfolding in real time. And so that was always my instinct. And then each of the stories that we were following kind of lent themselves to that. Even we had a whistleblower who'd been part of the poison program. And obviously his backstory talking about the poison program is incredibly interesting. But it was once he'd escaped from Russia, it was understanding he was now in a life or death situation with him and his family. And so the stakes were so high, and kind of that's what I wanted to capture was what is on the line for these people in these situations when you're willing to stand up to Putin and speak out. what you're potentially sacrificing. So yeah, we definitely wanted it to become something current and like understand the tension that they were all living through. But that makes it much harder as a filmmaker because you can't just be like, yeah, we'll film this interview, you'll shoot some shots around there, that location, da, 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 and then just like piece it together. You just genuinely don't know where you're going to end up. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
particularly with Christo's story, it was so unpredictable. And even the like country he was living in, like we thought he was going to be living in Austria and suddenly he has to move to New York. So you're like, it becomes financially, just logistically, you know, really challenging. So we went from having like crew, a kind of brilliant cinematographer, to just me shooting on like a small camera because you had to make the money stretch and just capture whatever was happening in that time. But I think in the end, that becomes a strength of the film because you feel like you are really living it. But yeah, it made it stressful. Definitely.
And the Oscar-winning Navalny documentary, I would say, gave another sort of publicity to Christo, Mr. Grozev, and Bellingcat as well, even though it centered around the now late politician.
Cool.
To some extent, the focus shifts between the different subjects here in Antidote, but mostly, I would say, our starting point and main point is Christo. How did you approach flipping the table and putting him at the center of the story? What did this change from a storytelling point of view?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because he played a crucial role in the Navalny investigation, in the film, and, you know, it was an incredible success to like expose the poisoners like live on camera. And, you know, that film had great success, but he hadn't really revealed much of himself, his personal life. Probably when we started this film, he was going to be like our guide into the different stories, but wasn't necessarily going to be so central. I always wanted to understand him on a personal level because he's a kind of enigmatic, mysterious person. So I always wanted that to be part of the film. But then obviously like what then happened with him and his family made it something that we had to obviously pursue and became much more central. And I think at first he was probably not that comfortable talking about personal subjects because, you know, he's a journalist. He's like obsessed with his work. He's comfortable focusing on that. He can talk all night about details and GRU officers and all this kind of thing. But asking him to like talk about himself or his family was less comfortable, I think. And then as things started to get, you know, more difficult for him on a personal level, I almost think, not that that made it easier, but I think like being with him during that time meant that he and I had like a bond. And he was more isolated as well because he couldn't live in Europe. He was on his own in New York. So we kind of, almost like me being around with my camera, you form a friendship, and it's not like it's like therapeutic for them, but it just became part of his like daily process, you know, and he like was able to talk to us at his like most vulnerable moments, which definitely like the first few times I'd met him didn't necessarily think that he would, you know, but I think it was sometimes when you film with someone who's going through something difficult, it does become a way of like processing it. It's like something to focus on is making the documentary. Strangely, I never felt really that I was like intruding after a certain point, and we like knew each other well enough. It felt very natural. But I definitely wouldn't have guessed that right at the beginning because he's not a politician. He's not someone who wants to be a public figure and share all this stuff. So, but in a way that makes him more interesting because to see him then like open up feels more revealing and kind of interesting. So yeah, it was like a process, but like I'm grateful that we had the time to like actually spend with him and follow the story through over time.
Yeah, and it's not even a question really, but it really caught me off guard how in the former film, in Navalny, he comes through as this sort of, in the best possible way, cold-blooded professional. And here it becomes so personal.
Yeah.
Just crazy.
I'm really glad that you say that because, yeah, that's my feeling as well. Like and he is this cold-blooded prophet. Like when it comes to his investigations, he's so obsessed. And actually, someone says it in the film. It's like with Christo, it would be easy to think that family isn't that important to him because he's so focused on his work. But actually, like all people, he needs that love and support. And like, I've seen him with his kids. It is, and his, him being so grateful for the like support and admiration of his dad. It was so clearly important to him. So like getting to know him and understand him on that human level felt really important, definitely.
The bonding that you just mentioned, you ended up together in this sort of two-man bubble. Yet I would guess that you have to keep some distance to maintain a level of professionalism in your relationship with him. How was balancing this?
Yeah. I mean, I guess like I consider him a friend, and like definitely I was with him at some emotionally difficult moments. For like going to his dad's home, for instance, was like just obviously hard for him. But I think, the way I always think about filming these difficult moments with people is like you have your like human side of your brain where you're like feeling for someone. And then you have your professional side, which is just about like knowing you need to capture this for the film. And you do have some objectivity and, you need to ask certain questions. And also because he is a journalist, he kind of, he was like conflicted because like his attitude to what had happened to him and his family and how much he wanted to investigate that was different to how he would investigate any other case where he's more removed from it, so that was interesting seeing like in the end he did want to do it, but it was like I think it maybe even gave him more perspective on the stories he'd done previously, that humans are involved and there are, all these people are family members and whatever. And so it was like, in a way, he was almost reluctant to be investigating his own case, although he did in the end. But yeah, I think as a filmmaker, you definitely have to like have a true friendship with the subject sometimes, but definitely have a distance and know this is what we need to tell the story powerfully and accurately. And actually he's a professional, so he was very accepting of what I needed to get from him, even when it wasn't necessarily what he would what he felt like doing.
And to dive a little bit into the technicalities and artistic decisions, the altering of the face and voice of the Russian scientists, it was pretty meticulously done. What's the technology behind that?
So it's done by a company called Teus, Teus, and I've seen some films they've done before, some documentaries. They did one called Welcome to Chechnya a few years ago. And basically we had filmed the scientist not knowing we would have to disguise his face because he was very determined to like be public and tell his story. And then the host country where he's now living didn't want him to show his face for his own security, for very understandable reasons. So we had to think like, can we still include his story and him be safe? What's the best way of doing that? Do we need to just like blur his face? So we had a conversation with Teus about what might be possible. And it's basically, it's a very convoluted, complicated process, but it's using AI to change the shape of their face, but maintain the kind of expression and the movement of the mouth. And so it feels not totally real, but it's not like completely distracting. Like you're still following the story. And I guess what was reassuring was like from the very beginning in my conversations with Teus, they were like so kind of adamant about the security and the safety of the person. It wasn't like they weren't frivolous about any of those details because we, like I said, this is like a matter of life and death. But they seemed really responsible, really determined to do things properly. And so we wanted to explore it. And then we did some tests and it felt like this is a way of doing it safely. Like no one would he looks totally different. No one will recognize him. I showed it to the scientist. He was like, great. I look really good. So he was happy. Obviously the most important thing is his safety and his family's safety. But it felt like a way of achieving that, but also keeping the power of his personal story. I'm sure in a few years it'll be much easier and quicker, like the way AI is developing. Like I'm sure in 5 years we'll have like an app on our phone that can do it. But for now, it was like took a lot of work.
It shows in the end.
Yeah. I'm glad. Yeah, it's like it's not like really bad, and it's improving so quickly that like every year it will get more and more convincing. And and there's a big debate in the documentary world about use of AI, and I think like the key for me is transparency. So like we're clear with the viewer, we've changed his features, and it's for a very simple reason, which is his safety. We're not doing it to like make the story more interesting or do this, or it's like purely to disguise his identity. So I think as long as you're like transparent about that, then it's okay. But it's going to be a big debate for a long time in our industry, I think.
And also we get some 3D animated scenes added to some talking head segments, which results in a feel where the former is narrated by the subject. And little additions like these can really make taking it in easier for general audiences. What was the concept behind this?
So we debated whether, because there were these backstories, whether you would do like dramatic reenactments, but I was always skeptical about that because because we wanted to make the film very much in the present moment. Sometimes you want to like blur the lines between what's real archive and what's dramatic footage that you shot yourself. But like with this, I wanted it to be really clear that there was like the backstory that could exist in this like animated universe. And then there was like the present moment that was like our real footage. And then in terms of the style of it, we wanted it to feel like, a bit kind of like a noirish, like spy movie with almost like a bit of like Russian, like modernism influence in it as well. And we worked with an animator called David Penn, who just did the most brilliant job. Like usually when you work with animators or even people doing like graphics, they send you something, you're like, no, send it back. It's like a back and forth. Everything he sent was great. Like first off the bat, he was just like, he just got the concept so well. And I think it, hopefully makes it like accessible and, what could be quite a dense and complicated and heavy film. Hopefully it's still dark, like the subject matter, but hopefully it's quite like watchable. It's not like, doesn't feel like hard work. So I think that animation hopefully was like part of that.
Well, James, thank you so much for taking the time. I could ask you questions for another hour, but thank you so much and congrats on this wonderful film.
Thanks so much. Really nice to meet you.